Namaste. Welcome to Such Conversations Matter. Conversations which represent the future we should have. I'm your host, Saurabh Nanda. Today's guest is Aditya Mallya. Aditya is the Mumbai City Director for Teach for India. Aditya has worked for Teach for India for almost 6 years, but his journey started off very different. In fact, Aditya and I are very close friends. We finished engineering together. He studied chemical engineering. I studied computer science. But in campus, we shared a lot of common interests about reading, about writing. We actually co-founded the institute's first student newsletter called Caps Lock. And those are some of our fondest memories. We co-organized a bunch of events and so on. Post engineering, he took up a job with a big FMCG corporation, worked on their in their manufacturing plant in North India. Post that, he finished his MBA from ISB, went on to become a consultant for Deloitte in India and the US. But 3 years into that, he took a giant shift. He actually did something that very few professionals of his caliber do, which is move into the development space. He joined Teach for India staff. He initially worked on strategy and currently is managing operations for the city of Mumbai for all the Teach for India work there is. He has been working for Teach for India, with Teach for India for almost 6 years now. And that is what our conversation today is all about. It's about fellowships in India, how India is becoming the fellowship capital of the world. What is the need for such fellowships? What is the impact? How do you measure the impact? What does the future hold for such fellowships? And why are fellowships changing the way we do things in education, in our professional lives, and all the other related skills associated? It's going to be a fascinating conversation. So please help me in inviting Aditya over. Hey Aditya, how are you?
Hello, Saurabh. I'm good. It's great to be speaking with you.
It is, isn't it? I think this is the first time we've spoken like this after college.
Yes, even in college, I don't think we had a conversation where there was a mic between us. So, for the first time we are speaking like this ever.
That is true. That is true. But either way, it's good to have you back in a conversation mode. I guess we used to have quite a few of them for our newsletter.
Yes.
Aditya, before we begin, and I know that you and I have so much to talk about, but just for the listeners, if you could summarize your professional journey so far, because you're the best person to do it.
Yeah, sure. Um, so, I think right after college and the college I shared with Saurabh, I joined ITC as an operations executive. So, I was placed at their plant in Haridwar and I worked there for 2 years in the soap division. So, I was with their personal care products division. So, I worked as an engineer there for 2 years. After that, I decided it was time to kind of just broaden my horizons a little bit. So that's when I applied to the Indian School of Business and I got through to their PGB program. So I did the 1 year course at ISB. After that, I joined Deloitte Consulting from ISB as part of the campus placement. Spent 3 years in Deloitte in the supply chain and manufacturing division. So I spent half my time in Hyderabad, where I was based, and half my time in the US, where most of the clients were. Post that, I took a few months off in around 2016. So that's when I realized that I sort of wanted to make a different, take my career in a different direction, or explore something different. I knew that I didn't really want to do consulting long term, even though I enjoyed the intellectual challenge of it. And I was just toying around with the idea of something completely different. And that's when I hit upon Teach for India. So initially, I thought of actually joining the Teach for India fellowship because I had some interest in teaching. But then I sort of missed the deadline because by the time I was contemplating this decision, the deadlines for the fellowship had already been closed. But then I learned that there were some staff roles that were open in Teach for India, and I explored those, joined a position called the Strategy and Learning Manager in Teach for India. And since then, since 2016, I've been here for around 5.5 years at Teach for India in a variety of roles. So primarily the first 3.5 years of those were with the strategy and learning team. In 2020, I made a switch to a more operational role, which is called the City Director of Mumbai. So Teach for India is now present in 8 cities, and one of those 8 cities is Mumbai, and I lead the city operations for Mumbai. So that's just a brief summary of what my journey has been like.
Amazing. Aditya, before we move on to the other set of the questions, I just want to know how does or why does somebody having the typical uh, top level career pathway that you've had, engineering and then MBA from a top school and then consulting, decide to move to the development sector, or as most of Indians understand, the NGO
Yeah.
sector in India?
So, I mean, I've never really thought about my career as like a specific journey, right? So, I didn't intend to start out by saying A, B, C, D, E. These are the steps that I want to take in my career. And I don't think I'll ever operate in that way. So, my decision making has always been based off what is it that at this moment seems most interesting to me, or seems most logical to me, and that's kind of guided my decision making at every process. So even starting from college, I would say, like, so I think I made the decision to, I think the reason you and I ended up at Jalandhar together, because Jalandhar is a very odd place for somebody from Goa to go. It's very different. So more, I was the only person from my batch who kind of went that far out of my state. And that's because I wanted to do chemical engineering specifically. Now, when I think back, I don't know why I really wanted to do chemical engineering. There's something about it that appealed to me. But because I knew I wanted to do that, I sort of applied through AIEEE. My rank at that time was only good enough to get me like a few colleges that were available. So there was Jalandhar and then there was Warangal. So I got into Jalandhar. So starting from that, it's just been like, what kind of makes the most sense, or what kind of seems appealing at this point of time. So ITC at campus seemed like an appealing company. It seemed like an interesting company. I didn't actually intend to kind of apply to ITC. There's somebody kind of convinced me to just go along for the process, just to be part of the experience. And then while I was in the placement discussions with them, it just seemed like when they gave the presentation and all that, it seemed like an interesting company. After that, I knew that after 2 years in ITC, I had kind of maxed out my learning from the manufacturing and operations side of things. And I felt like I need to know more about how do you actually run a business, and how does the other functions of a business like branding, marketing, all of that come into play, because I had experienced that a little bit on the shop floor but not really understood it deeply. That's what led me to MBA, and that's what led me to ISB. Again, similarly from there, I think consulting just seemed like a very natural fit for somebody like me who likes analysis, likes structured thinking. We did study a few kind of consulting cases as part of the B school curriculum, and I just enjoyed that style of thinking. So that seemed like a logical step at that time. So even though my journey up until that point has been very cliched, it's been like, engineer, MBA sort of thing. It didn't, in my mind, it wasn't really playing out as sort of that standard path. I was just making independent decisions, which coincidentally seemed to fall on that standard path at that point of time. But it just so happened that the next decision I took didn't fall on that standard path, right? So similarly in consulting, I found myself in a point where I really liked the intellectual aspect of it, but I knew that I didn't want to do the other relationship and sales aspect of it in the long term, because that's not where my interests lie. And then I was just literally thinking about what actually is it that interests me, because now I've spent a bit of time here, and what's the other thing that would interest me. And I was actually thinking of two things. So one was writing, which, as you know, I've always kind of had like a side interest in, and the second was teaching. So in the few months that I took off after Deloitte, I did spend a bit of time even doing some freelance writing. I used to write like some movie reviews and stuff for a website. And I explored this teaching fellowship thing on the side and Teach for India on the side. So yeah, to summarize for me, like it's just been like what seems most interesting at each point of time, and therefore what can I do. I don't think of it as, even now I don't really have a clear path in mind to say 5 years, 10 years from now what I want to do. My suspicion is that I'll probably be doing something very different, because I like diversity in work also. Like I would prefer not to go very deep into one area as much as I would prefer learning as much as I can about multiple areas. So I've typically had like a complete career switch every 2, 3 or 4 years. So I could be approaching at that point also sometime soon in this journey, I guess.
Wow. So that basically what tells me is that you're a very curious person, and your decision making is kind of a function of um, intellectual stimulation or the lack
Yeah, that's
thereof.
exactly it, actually.
All right. And so far, I mean, looking at your career graph, Teach for India has somehow managed to keep you intellectually stimulated and occupied for almost 6 years now.
That's true. I think that's because I've had two drastically different roles in Teach for India. So they've almost felt like two different jobs entirely. And I think that's the secret of that. So the first 3.5 years was it was almost like a consulting role, but within Teach for India. Uh, but the reason, again, around the 3 year mark, I started feeling like I'm kind of maxing out my level of interest or value that I'm adding here. And that's when I started seeking a change. And this role just happened to be open at that point of time, which is what led me to apply to it within Teach for India. Uh, this is a very different role, so it's much more on the ground, much more related to the operations of the actual work, much more involves driving work through people rather than sort of doing the work yourself. There's an also an element of intellect and strategy involved with it also, which I think is essential to keep me interested. But I think what kind of led me to this role is also just how far out of my comfort zone it was, because of the amount of on ground work, operations, firefighting, people related issues, all of that. I just wanted to kind of test myself on those dimensions also. So yeah, I think what's kept me here so long is obviously I think a central belief in the work of Teach for India itself, but also just the fact that it's been two different roles, which has given me that intellectual stimulation that I also require in a job.
So isn't that very interesting? As in, you start off by solving pure problems with limited variables and kind of in a
Yeah,
controlled situation. We like solving those problems, whether it is on the manufacturing floor or for consulting cases. But as you grow older, the intellectual simulation stops happening, or stops coming from those kind of cases, because you probably have dealt
yeah,
with them, and you automatically gravitate towards more complicated nuanced situations which mostly involve people.
yeah,
Even though initially, as an engineer or as a consultant, you probably didn't want to deal with them, but you end up doing that
yeah.
anyhow.
Very true. I think as you rightly say, when you become older, you have more experience, you experience more complicated situations both in your personal life as well as you see the complexity in the world that's unfolding around you, right? And I think you ultimately sort of come to a realization that any great thing that you have to accomplish in the world, you can't do it without people. So you can only sort of, I mean, there's not much that you can do individually also. There's very limited, it can only sort of take you so far. um, you sort of have to kind of involve other people in it if you want to really succeed on a large scale. Even if you're doing something that seems solitary, like writing a book, for example, ultimately you want people to read that book, right? So you can't escape the element of the fact that you'll have thousands of people, maybe millions of people engaging with that, and that has to play into how you think about it, and it will have consequences in how it plays out once you release it. So yeah, I think in the modern world, especially, there's no way to get around the fact that you have to work with people, and that's why I think if you're somebody who thinks analytically about the problems facing whatever your life, society, the world at large, and you try to think about the root causes of those. The solutions for those again ultimately deal with like shifting mindsets or shifting, like how people think about things and how people work together and collaborate. So again, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think eventually, all sort of curious people, even though they might at first seem intellectual and analytical and detached, somehow I think they might end up gravitating more towards sort of, or at least having like, or at least dabbling in like people related problems at some point in their life, whether they want to or not.
That is absolutely true. That is exactly the kind of situation that I am in as well, and it is surprising at the same time. It is exciting as well, because what I've realized is, when we deal with people problems, or most problems are
Yeah,
people problems, there is no end to the complexity. So there is always another problem lurking behind the supposed success of a problem which we solve today. There is always going to be something that you will have to do tomorrow in order to do that. And is that part of the allure of actually being involved in the people process? And you've been doing this for 6 years now. So is it that has kept you here? And probably you'll keep on being here, because there's no end to the
yeah.
complexity.
So the first 3 years in Teach for India, to be honest, I didn't experience much of that because my role was quite removed from the ground. I was working with a fairly small team that was again quite detached from the ground. Um, so didn't really face a lot of this in the first 3 years, even though the core work of the organization is still leadership development. I have experienced it a lot in this new role, that which is the city director of Mumbai role that I've been doing since June 2020. Um, I wouldn't say that that's the core reason that keeps me here. It's definitely initially when I first was experiencing like the challenges of working with such a large group of people, right? Because I have an 18-member staff team now, and the number of fellows in Mumbai is 130, so it's a very large team. So the first few months were very, very challenging for me because I didn't quite know how to navigate those issues. Because people are not like Excel sheets; you can't sort of adjust them in the same way, or like tweak them in such a detached way. Um, but yeah, I mean, now I've come to look on it in an interesting way, as you know, look on it as a challenge, look on it as a work, a necessary piece of work that needs to be done. I think I have a lot of belief in the fact that if you really unlock the potential within each person, like limitless things are possible, right? And I think you see so many examples of, I'm sure we'll talk about fellowships in a little bit, but in fellowships like the Teach for India fellowship, you see a lot of examples of huge transformational shifts in mindsets that people have. um, and I think that gives me a lot of belief to say like what's possible if you actually find the right way to motivate somebody, invest somebody, unlock their potential, help them grow them, develop them. I think like incredible things are actually possible through that. um, I think maybe that's what keeps me here and in this work. And also fundamentally, I just love learning, right? So I think I was drawn to Teach for India because I have a love of learning, and that gives me a deep belief in education. So I don't think anything will change my belief in the power of education. So, and this is an organization that's at the forefront of sort of creating leaders in the face of education. So I think that vision alignment and mission alignment is what has kept me at Teach for India.
That makes absolute sense. And I would love to keep on going
Yeah,
about the nuances of how our minds work, and where they get stimulated intellectually or otherwise, and how that translates into good career decisions. But for the sake of time and this particular conversation, and you've already started on that thread as well. Aditya, how does Teach for India work? And what are the various aspects around it? What are its objectives, mission, and are we close to achieving that? What is the plan? Do you get to interact with Shaheen Misri on a daily basis?
yeah.
What happens?
I'll start by telling you about Teach for India's vision and mission because a lot of the work flows from that. Teach for India's vision is that one day all children in India will attain an excellent education, right? So that's what we want to achieve in the long term. And Teach for India's mission is that we want to build a movement of leaders who will work towards doing this. So actually, the core work that Teach for India is doing is building leaders. So there's a pipeline of leaders that we're developing for the education sector in India. So that ultimately, that pipeline of leaders will work collectively over the years to make excellent education possible for every child. So that's the gist of what Teach for India stands for. Now, how this works is there are two parts to it. So we call it the short-term theory of change, and there's a long-term theory of change. The short-term theory of change is rooted in a fellowship program. So the Teach for India fellowship is the thing that most people know about Teach for India. It's a 2-year program. So what we do is we hire, promising young leaders. I'm saying young, but some of them are slightly older as well. But most of them are young. So most of them are typically just out of undergrad or they've spent a few years working. So we hire them and we place them in low income schools. So these are either government schools or low income private schools. And we place them in the schools for 2 years as full time teachers. So what we do is we partner with existing schools that already have teaching vacancies, right? So that's a big problem in India where a lot of schools don't have enough teachers. So we find schools like this in the cities that we're present in, and we go to a government school that say has teaching shortages that needs a good teacher, and we partner with them and say, we'll give you this person, we'll fully train the fellow, and we'll give you this person as a full-time teacher for 2 years for 2 years, and then after 2 years we'll give another person, and so on. Like we just keep the partnership going, either with a government school or a low-income private school. So in the short term, what we're doing is we're kind of providing a temporary solution to the teaching shortage and the vacancy of teachers by providing high quality teachers that we ourselves train for a period of 2 years. And what we do is we ensure that a classroom any classroom that we're intervening in has access to a Teach for India fellow until they graduate 10th grade. So we typically enter a classroom in third grade. So which means that third grade and fourth grade, that class will be taught by one fellow, That fellow will then leave because it's a 2-year fellowship program. But then you'll have another fellow coming and teaching them for fifth and sixth grade. Then another fellow coming to teach them for seventh and eighth, and another fellow coming for ninth and tenth. So from third to tenth grade, they have complete coverage of the by a Teach for India fellow, at least for that classroom, right? And what we see is that the data has shown us that, and we've done some independent studies that third parties have also conducted. The growth that a child has in learning is significantly higher if a Teach for India intervention covers them for like 7-8 years, compared to if Teach for India had not intervened in that classroom, right? So we see like really big gains in how much they're able to read, their literacy scores and their math scores. The literacy and math grew significantly by continuous exposure to Teach for India's fellowship than if there was no fellow teaching them, than if it was a regular teacher. So that's the short-term theory of change. So in the short term, we are kind of providing high-quality education to some students directly through the fellowship program. But the fellowship program is actually a way to sort of ignite our long-term theory of change. And in the long term, what's happening is that you have all these young people that are coming in, spending 2 years on the ground in the classroom, really working at the grassroots, right? Serving low-income children, and they really understand what are the troubles of the Indian education system overall. So they really understand that at a very fundamental level because they've lived it, and that's not like they're just reading it or hearing about it. They've lived it. They know what it's like to teach in a classroom. What are the difficulties? They know what's good and what's not good about the system. And what we see is that most of them develop a strong passion for staying in the education sector, and that's really the what we want to do through this fellowship program. So that's the long-term theory of change, which is our alumni movement. So Teach for India started in 2009, and in the last 13 years, we've had more than 4,000 alumni, which means fellows who have done the fellowship across 7 cities. 4,000 fellows have done the fellowship across 7 cities. And around 70% of them are working in the education sector in a variety of different roles. Right? So some of them are continuing to be teachers. Some of them are working in, say, curriculum design. Some of them are working in education technology companies. Some of them are entrepreneurs and have started their own education companies. Some of them are working in the social sector, but not directly in the education sector, and so on. So we have more than 70% of our 4,000 alumni that continue to work towards this educational equity movement, right? So, and that's our long-term theory of change. So that goes back to what I was talking about, which is in the long term, we are creating leaders who will stay in education and collectively over time work to make education in the country excellent. But in the short term, the fellowship is also a way for them to practice and provide that excellent education directly as teachers. So that's a little bit of a nutshell of what Teach for India does. I'll just pause there and see whether you have any questions before I move on to some of the other things you asked. Yeah,
I have a bunch of questions, but yeah. Okay, so let me just start with. So I've worked with a bunch of TFI fellows over the last few years, and some of them are close friends now. And there have been clients that we have actually actively pushed towards joining TFI, and the 2 year experience at TFI has completely changed their lives. One of our clients, she studied pharma because, well, everyone wants to do something in science, and she hated it. And then she wanted to know what should I do. And after our assessment, we got to know that she's really gunning
yeah,
for making some impact. And there was no better place than TFI. Currently she's pursuing a social innovation course in London School of Economics, and that is primarily because of her experience at TFI. And I don't think
yeah,
any pharma experience would have led to that. I mean, I'm sure there must have been something
yeah,
which could have led to that, but with TFI we knew for sure. um, so those are the people that I've worked with. Now, I can clearly see I've that those leaders are created at the grassroots with the help of TFI. Now, one of my close friends and our junior from college, he's an education researcher. He's
mhm,
currently pursuing his PhD in the field of education. And I had him on my first season, episode 23, I think 22, wherein he talked about the fact that, see, if you develop leaders at the bottom, the education system in
yeah,
India, they need leaders basically, and that's exactly what TFI does. If you create leaders at the bottom, that's great. Bottom of the pyramid, amazing to have so many leaders. But if there are no proper leaders or people having the vision of inculcating or actually
yeah,
encouraging that leadership so that they can actually grow towards the top of the pyramid and make more impact, if that doesn't exist, then probably creating leaders at the bottom of the pyramid also will not result
Yeah.
in a lot of impact. I hope that makes sense. Do you have any
No, that's
comment on
very
that?
true. I think it's like any other organization or company, right? So I think it's any institution is only as strong as its leadership, I would say. So uh, if even if I was working in a manufacturing company, the quality of, say, whatever the soap or the food or whatever it is that I'm manufacturing, it is going to differ from company to company, and ultimately that quality is going to be driven by what is the strength of leadership and systems in that organization, right? So starting with the CEO, what is the strength of their vision, how effectively can they translate that vision into action, and how strong is the management overall in the organization, such that those principles of quality are maintained at the bottom level. And this holds true for any organization. And just I think a fellowship can be looked at as an organization where, instead of the end product being like soap, or instead of the end product being like a packet of Maggie or whatever, the end product is actually like a leader. That's the only difference, but the principle still holds true. I think if the quality of leadership is not strong at the top and throughout the organization, you're not going to get strong quality leaders in at the bottom.
So I know that a lot of top management leaders such as yourself from TFI, they keep on appearing on a lot of panels and forums and whatnot. But and this is again just an understanding of the ecosystem here. Um, how much of that impact has been increasing, let's say, in policy making?
Yeah.
TFI is a young organization, 13 years old, but amazing amount of impact. But how much of that influence has been increasing in let's say policy circles in
Policy
India?
circles, I would say not much. Overall influence is definitely increasing though. So policy is something that's very hard to sort of crack, right? It's even people who are working in policy find it hard to kind of crack policy. So for people who are not in that domain, I think it's even harder to kind of get a foot in the door. Um, I would say what we have seen overall is that, if I were to summarize the impact that Teach for India as an organization is having in the last 13 years, we've definitely had impact in getting people to get into the education sector and stay in the education sector. So 70%, as I mentioned, of alumni who have completed the fellowship staying in the education sector out of choice, and it's not like they don't have options. That's a huge achievement, I would say, because what you're doing is actually shifting the mindset of people. Because before the fellowship, they're coming from like, they're not coming from like non-profit backgrounds, or they're not. It's not like they studied undergrad in like social sciences or something like that. These are people who are coming who have studied engineering, studied arts, studied literature, or people who have worked in corporate backgrounds. That's the background of people coming into the fellowship, but then 70% of them are staying in the education sector, right? So that's one big piece of impact. Second is, I think we do seem to breed an entrepreneurial spirit. So I think Teach for India alumni have founded something like 70, 80 organizations across the country. I think we also have alumni in leadership positions in like 150, 200 organizations and so on. So that's definitely an area of impact as well. And third is, I would say, the actual impact on the children who are being taught in the fellowship. So as I mentioned, the growth that we see in the learning of the students is much higher compared to like non-teach for India classrooms. We also have a very high rate of graduation at 10th grade. So most of our students end up graduating 10th grade, the students that go through our classrooms. And we see a huge shift in also the way that students conduct themselves. So we have sort of something called a student vision scale within Teach for India, which is how we measure holistic education. And we see that, our students are very evolved in not just being proficient in academics, or more proficient in academics than the average child, but they have a very high level of self-awareness, reflection. They understand more about themselves. They have, I would say, an evolved moral sense of duty to self, other, and to the country. So that's really almost an intangible impact that you can't really quantify. So far our impact has been more in those domains. I think we are trying to get more and more alumni working in the field of policy and education. That's definitely been a gap for us. So not we don't have many alumni. In fact, we could probably count it on two hands the number who are doing meaningful work in policy. So for example, we have one alumnus who is currently working in the Delhi government. In fact, he drafted, I think, the Delhi government's education manifesto. So that's the most influential alum that I can think of who's working in the policy space. Apart from that, we have people who are working, say, in organizations that like Central Square Foundation and so on that consult with the government. We have some alumni that are working, say, on a few projects with government and so on. But as a whole, the policy and governance space is quite underrepresented compared to, say, the teaching space or the school impact space. In terms of the work that our alumni is doing. So yeah, as policy and advocacy, that's an area that is has not been a strength for us in the past, but we're looking to strengthen it by getting more alumni to work in those areas. We've also started a new government relations vertical within Teach for India as of last year. So this is the newest vertical within Teach for India, and that's aimed at kind of having a deeper impact on policy and advocacy over the next decade or so. So the next decade, this is a big priority for Teach for India.
All right, all right. I have a theory about social change. It's just a theory. I don't have any data to prove it, but I think you might relate to it. What I feel is every people's movement or every change at a systemic level. Um, yes, it starts off small, but
Yeah,
it needs to reach a particular threshold, that critical mass, right? When and then then it becomes important, and everything else shapes around it rather than the other way around, right? And I might ask you to be a a soothsayer here, or somebody who can predict the future. But do you think, when do you think organizations like TFI and Dream a Dream, or Gandhi Fellowship, Ramal Foundation, Azim Premji Foundation, when do you think they will have enough alumni, enough people to push the envelope beyond that critical mass, so that actual policy making starts reflecting
yeah.
their findings?
So interestingly, it's quite a coincidence you mentioned this because we've been thinking about this a lot in our strategy for the next decade as Teach for India. And there's this very interesting paper. Uh, I forget the name of the scientist who kind of came up with this paper. I'll look it up, or you can maybe look this up, and the listeners can look this up as well. But it's called the 3.5% rule. So there's some person who's done research and found that for any idea to sort of become a social movement, it crosses that threshold and that threshold seems to be 3.5% of the population of the whatever that place is, right? So, for example, if it's Indian freedom movement, and India's population is 1 billion, that 3.5% of 1 billion would be that threshold. So that's the way that I mean, it's up to the listeners to kind of go through that paper and see how much they resonate with that. But it's a thought provoking idea, which is to say that if you can invest some small percentage and kind of tip the threshold, then the movement will start to take a life of its own. And I think that's the principle that we are trying to adopt as Teach for India. So what we are doing is saying that can we send our fellows out into the movement with a really strong mindset and a very clear vision of what we want to achieve in education for the country? And then if fellows are doing that and alumni are working in that vision, each of those people is in turn going to impact several more people, right? So the people that they are working in organizations, if they assume leadership roles, they have a much more likelihood that they'll impact people's mindset and be able to shape people's mindsets around this. Additionally, we're going to do a lot of things related to advocacy and getting the word out there. So I think what you're referring to, things like the panel discussions we've seen our leaders being part of, or the editorials that we're writing, or just even trying to have conversations with governments across cities. We're just trying to get more and more of our message out there. Our hope is that by in the next decade, we are actually able to get this movement to be like to take on a life of its own. And I whether it'll actually happen or not, I don't know because I can't predict that. But yeah, I think it's probably more of a question of decades rather than like years because it's a very long term change that we're thinking about. But yeah, I do see a future in which that happens eventually.
Absolutely. I mean, thanks for that. Really interesting. I would say a little segue. Also, I'll definitely like to go into it. I recently came across that research actually, and it's a kind of serendipitous that we're discussing about it. It is, and I'm bad with names, so I don't remember the name of the researchers. But yeah,
Yes.
there are two sociology researchers, and a little bit of social psychology as well. And what they started doing was they started looking into violent and non-violent revolutions which have happened over the last many centuries, to see which revolutions are actually more successful. Because there are primarily two schools of thought that to get change you need to be violent about
Yeah.
it, or you need to grab the thing by its horns or whatever. And then there is the thought that you just need to be non-violent and keep on pushing. And that is what their research was about. Yes. And when I read about that and I listened to that sociologist, one of the sociologists, she actually said that the 3.5% number is now becoming too famous, because
Yeah.
people are not looking into the nuance of it. And what it basically means is, yes, if you have 3% of the population with you, then the movement is
Yeah.
taking a lot of credible shape. But you need to understand 3.5% of the population will be there with you protesting or getting involved in non-violent activities or violent activities, but it still needs to have
Yeah.
around 90% of the support from the population. So 90% of the population still needs to support that idea, and 3.5% need
Yeah.
to actively participate in it, right? So that's what it means more. But yeah, fascinating segue into that. How we love quantifying everything. In fact, just in the last episode, I was talking to Dr. Bhakti Devi about water
Hmm.
conservation at a local level in India and why it's not happening. And she basically said everyone wants to do it. So you
Yeah.
definitely have 90% population support. They don't have the tools to do it. And that's when she's creating a Jal fellowship with Rishi Hood University based out of Sonipat, wherein they are going to create a Jal fellow in the 750 odd districts in India, so that they can start bringing change about water conservation across all the 750 districts according to their needs of
Right.
that district, because India is such a diverse country, right? So uh, fascinating about that. The other thing which came about out of that discussion was that you said it will
Yeah.
be probably decades and whatnot, and which again sounds true, because if we look at the statistics right now, um, we've never had more people working or studying public policy, public administration in India than ever, right? And talking about quantifying, as Dr. Bhakti Devi also said, data doesn't really matter at a local level. Why? Because if you have the evidence right in
Yeah.
front of you, you just need to act on it. So whether it is 3.5% or not, you better
Yeah.
start doing the work. So my next question, and we've kind of very nicely flowed into that, is what do you think is the right way to measure the impact of the fellowships? You've
Yeah.
talked about tangible and intangible impact, influence, advocacy, and so on. But what do you personally feel after working almost 6 years in this space? What is the right way to measure the impact of fellowships, whether it is
Yeah.
TFI or a JAL
I would
fellowship?
say the only right way is to take a very nuanced approach to measuring the impact of the fellowship. I think of any fellowship. I can speak about Teach for India in more detailed context, but I think the learnings would apply to any kind of initiative like this. And the reason for that is because I think there's you sort of run into a wall if you just try and reduce everything to like one number or two numbers or three numbers, because it's very difficult to do that, or maybe even impossible to do that when at the core of the work that you're doing is ultimately people development, right? So I think when you're talking about people, when you're talking about leaders and how to develop people as leaders, there's only so much objective data that you can put around that, because there's always going to be an intangible element of the human aspect which you can't really capture in any metrics. So I think the key is to figure out how to tell that story using a combination of different metrics and tools and stories. Right. So for example, if you look at Teach for India, what how would we tell the story of our impact? I think I've been doing that throughout this conversation in some sense of form, right? So part of what I've been telling you is kind of metricize, which is saying that say for example, compared to non-TFI classrooms, we know that TFI classrooms grow by like 7 times in English over a 7 year period or something, or a 5 year period or something like that, right? So that's a quantifiable impact metric that I can tell you. But then I'm also telling you slightly more qualitative things that, like so many of our alumni are in leadership positions, or they're more entrepreneurial and they're starting organizations. And I'm trying to put a little bit of quantification in that also by saying number of alumni in leadership positions, number of alumni who have started ventures, percentage of alumni staying in education. So you can kind of put a little bit of a mix of quantitative and qualitative metrics. But I think what really brings alive work like this is stories and um, different stories that illustrate the spectrum of experiences and impact that people are having, right? So I think I briefly told you about this alum, Anurag Kundu, who's working with the Delhi government. So that was the one I was referring to. But that's one story that's telling you what one alumnus out of 4,000 is doing. But say if I were to give you like 50 stories, which are of alumni of very different backgrounds and doing very different things, that will give you a good idea to say, okay, like if I look at these 50, that kind of gives me a loose representation of what this 4,000 alumni in totality must be doing. And then I can marry that with my 4 or 5 metrics of, oh, I know about the growth that these students make in learning and literacy and math. I know what the percentage of alumni staying in education. I know about the percentage of alumni who are leading ventures or in leadership positions. And then that kind of creates a picture of impact in my mind. Yeah, but I think in summary, I think it needs to be a combination of qualitative and quantitative metrics plus illustrative stories that really bring out the human aspect of the work that's being done. And yeah, I think I'm saying this in context of Teach for India, but I think this will probably hold true for any fellowship, because fellowships at its core are just about that, right? It's about like how do you develop people while also solving like some other short term problem statement in the near term. Yeah.
Very interesting. Actually, you brought out another very interesting point, and you know, Abhijit Banerjee, when he started doing some research around as to okay, how does change happen and so on. In the early 2000s, he collaborated with an NGO based out of Udaipur in Rajasthan, and they did a small study around rural Udaipur, Rajasthan, uh, rural schools in Udaipur. The literacy rate for females over
Mhm.
there was very bad at around 2% or something, and that's why they chose that area. Now, what they did was, and this is coming from an American school of thought, that student teacher ratio is a key metric in understanding
Mhm.
whether the quality of education improves or not. And a lot of schools we see today, both at high school level and at college level, they keep on talking about student teacher ratio. So they said, okay, fine, let's try and improve the student teacher ratio, and see what is the impact. And I think the existing student teacher ratio in those schools was around
Mhm.
the typical
Mhm.
Indian ratio, which is 1 to 40, 1 to 45.
Mhm.
What they did was they halved that. So they employed more teachers, and they halved that ratio. So it was around 1 to 20 now, one teacher for every 20 students. Obviously, their hypothesis was now the test scores will increase, and
Mhm.
the understanding, the literacy will increase.
Mhm.
But what happened was it didn't change at all, because what they realized then was, okay, why didn't
Yeah.
it change? Because this is so counterintuitive. It didn't change because the test scores were not only dependent on how uh, what the quality of discourse from the teacher is. It also
Yeah.
dependent on the kids, where are they coming from, their nutrition,
Correct.
have they performed over the previous classes, do they have the
Yeah.
foundation to learn the new curriculum and whatnot. So it didn't really change, and that is why just following quantitative data and creating theories out of it might not work, especially when you have different cultures across the world. So, thank you so much for bringing out that it has to be a combination of quantitative and
Yeah.
qualitative stories really
Yeah.
bring it out, because context is so important. Um, Talking about fellowships, Aditya, I think India being the NGO capital of the world, and this was announced by
Yeah.
Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2007, 2008, that India has the largest number of NGOs in the world, and I think we still lead that tally. Um, India might soon become the fellowship
Mhm.
capital of the world if it has not already become that. Do you think having more fellowships? I have seen
Yeah.
fellowships which are online, offline, starting ranging from 15 days to 3 years, paid, unpaid, or they pay you a stipend, right? Of all types and shapes and colors,
Yeah.
impacting everything under the 17 SDGs. Do you think having more fellowships in India is again sort of a function of the fact that we are so diverse? We need more decentralized, nuanced, contextualized learning and
Yeah, I
development
think so. I think
experiences.
one is that there's a large number of people in the country. There's a large number of people in the country that need help, and there's also a large number of people in the country that want to help. So I think these three things combined will invariably lead to, a lot of NGOs, and then also a lot of fellowships, because a fellowship is in a way it's like an NGO that is kind of focusing its attention in on one problem statement, and then trying to kind of bound it and develop a leader also in the long term.
So okay, people have understood fellowships are the thing, and they work to a certain extent, and now everyone just is
Yeah.
trying to name their immersion program as a fellowship, right? Do you think we are trying to create a formula around learning experiences, and it might, it might
I don't know whether
backfire?
that's the right way to look at it, because I think this is happens in any market, right? So, any time that one particular kind of movie succeeds, you'll see a lot of movies being made along that same theme, right? Like, so superhero movies are like very in for the last 15-20 years, because a few movies succeeded. And you see this time and time again, like any product that succeeds also, you'll always find like other people getting into that, because what has been demonstrated is that it's been shown in the market that this particular product or service is needed, and that there's a market for it, and it can succeed. So that's kind of like a signal of encouragement for other people who wanted to also make a movie or wanted to build like some product, that okay, if I see somebody else has done it, it kind of gives me like sort of an encouragement to say, maybe I also had some thought of wanting to do something like this. Let me also kind of follow in this person's footsteps and this organization's footsteps and do something like this. So I would see this as like, um, evidence of like the market for this work working as it should, which is that, you see one or two organizations like this succeeding, and then you see that emboldening other organizations to kind of follow suit. And because what they are seeing is that this is a model that actually is working, so they're seeing some success in it, which is why they're trying to emulate it. So yeah, I would welcome that. And like, I think as most markets do over time, the market will kind of lead to the most optimal equilibrium solution, right? So ultimately, if there's no fundamental demand for this, which means that ultimately over time you'll see the fellowships consolidating, or you'll see some of them dying out because there's not enough demand for them. But then if there is actually demand, then you'll see some of them flourishing. You might see more coming in their place. So I think this just has to kind of play out a little bit over the next few years.
Interesting. In fact, see, how I define fellowships is, they essentially are plugging the gaps which exist in our current academic, industrial, governmental, developmental matrix, and which these respective, organizations
Yeah.
working in these respective areas are not able to do that. But do you think, as you rightly mentioned, the market will obviously move towards, a better instrument or a more refined way of doing this? Do you think, so fellowships are kind of a short term thing, like a 15-20 year thing, 2 decades, and then we will have inculcated all the good things that we have to learn into our traditional and formal ways of learning and working?
That's a very good question. I think the that could go either way. I don't necessarily think they have to be short term, because um, I'll make the argument for both cases, and then I'll tell you like what my thought is. So on the one hand, you could argue that they are short term things, because once you sort of achieve your purpose, you're sort of redundant, right? And probably I think an organization like Teach for India would be happy to become redundant, because if we actually get to a point where one day we achieve excellent education, then great. Like we'll be happy to like cease to exist as an organization. So that's the argument to say that, yeah, I think maybe a fellowship could be short term, because if you realize that you're reaching your objectives, maybe you like discontinue this fellowship or your fellowship program and move to something more long term. Um, but I think you could also argue that that philosophy is true of any kind of organization, right? So um, whether it's like a learning institute or a learning university, which is more permanent, you could make the same argument that that should shut down at some point if everybody has learned everything there is to learn about whatever, like economics, especially in the modern world where information is available to everybody. Like you could argue like what really is the purpose of permanent universities? Are they becoming obsolete? So I think you could look at it from both ways. The way that my opinion is that, I personally see these as like potential long term institutions and organizations which will evolve over time. So as the sector evolves around it, the purpose of these organizations will evolve. Right. So, for example, if I take Teach for India, right now it's still very much, even though we're 13 years old, 13 years is not much in this larger scheme of things, right? So we're still, I would say, in early days in the history of our organization. We're right now very, very far away from all children in India having an excellent education. So I think Teach for India is going to be around for decades. But for example, over the decades, our function may differ a little bit, right? So potentially, if there are more fellowships out there that start to develop teaching and teaching becomes a stronger practice, maybe the fellowships of the future will move slightly away from teaching and move more into the space of, say, what you were talking about earlier, which is like policy and advocacy and all of that. So you could see like ways in which fellowships like this could evolve. But I think I see them, I don't necessarily see them as short term, because ultimately they've been born out of some, some central vision. And I think utopia is something that can never really be achieved. It's something that has to be either worked towards or maintained actively once you get close to it. So I think as long as you are working towards something or trying to actively maintain something, there'll be a space for an organization like this. It's just that how it looks exactly in structural terms or in the nuts and bolts of it might evolve over time. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense actually. My only challenge as an educator is like when I encourage a lot of people who have finished their formal education to a certain level. For example, a lot of engineers who just recently pass out from top 50 institutes in India, including NITs and IITs. When they come to me and they ask for what should we do, we really didn't enjoy the experience, and we're not really sure what to do even after cracking all the entrance examinations and whatnot and surviving that the entire thing. And when I recommend fellowships to them, so the first question that comes to their mind is about the validity of such an instrument and how it's going to help. And it takes a little bit of time to tell them that this will open up doors which traditional education systems do not, or what your learning and development arm of the HR in your organization will never do. This
Yeah.
actually kind of opens up that. And they're still not sure about it because they have been conditioned in such a way for such a long time that they don't see that as valid instruments. So yeah, that is where this question basically arose from. But okay, do you think that yeah, I just with the example of Rishi Hood University, a government of India recognized university, opening up a program which is basically a certificate program, but they're calling it a fellowship because they can't really call it a degree. They can't really
Right.
call it something else. Fellowships in the academia world are about PhD research fellowships. It's not really about this, but they're
Right.
embracing it. And I personally think that we need more fellowships than less, because there are so many nuanced situations. The other thing is, I personally feel, and please, I would like to ask this question to you as well. Do you think that our formal education systems today have not been able to capture certain skill sets, or the teaching of those skill sets which a lot of people are enabled with right now, but they are missing from the university? So if you need to learn something like that, you need to directly go and ask that person or that small outfit to teach you.
I don't think you need to sort of have been in the education sector to answer this question. I feel like anybody who has gone to a school in India, college in India can answer this question, right? So what is it that we really use in our day-to-day lives right now, which we've learned in college, right? So, and the answer is very little. So I think that answers the question. So I think there's no doubt that the education systems that we're working with are like sort of very obsolete, or like not really serving the, they're not sort of mirroring how life is, right? So it's sort of like a series of facts that you kind of like memorize through school. But I think the education of the future is very much about like your development as an individual, right? So how do you holistically develop as an all-round personality? So obviously knowledge is a huge part of that. And by the way, I'm somebody who loved school. I loved the memorization. I actually liked all the rote learning and all of that. So maybe I'm not the best person to be talking about this, but maybe that gives me more credibility to talk about this because I'm somebody who enjoyed and thrived in that kind of system. But I feel like it's not really relevant to how you live life at all, right? So I think if you look at what the world of the future requires, and that's evident from like what organizations and companies today require. They require people who are good with, like, say, complex problem solving, people who are good with collaboration, people who can sort of keep their mind open, people who are flexible, people who are adaptable, people who can kind of work in a variety of different scenarios and contexts, people who kind of imbibe knowledge from different disciplines in the world and so on. Like, there's a series of, maybe you'd call them 21st century skills that people need to have in the modern workplace, and I think the modern world. And the schooling system right now doesn't work towards that at all. The national education policy, which was recently released by the government, that does actually address some of this, and it talks about wanting to develop 21st century skills. Uh, but I think, as with any sort of government initiative, you never know how it's actually going to be implemented. And I wouldn't just blame the government or hold the government to this, because I think this is a societal sort of thing in India, right? So I think this is going to require like a bigger overhaul, and that's ultimately what an organization like Teach for India is working towards, right? So making this vision of excellent education more visible to everybody. Yeah, so I think that's just what I'm thinking. I feel like, yeah, to answer your question, I think there's definitely huge gaps in what the current education system, both schools as well as higher education, has in terms of preparing people for the actual world outside.
Right. In fact, I was just going to, cut you off in the middle when you were actually listing down those skills, because I said, thank you for listing down the 21st century skills which are needed.
Yeah,
But yeah, so that's exactly what I believe in as well. Okay, Aditya, I've taken enough of your time. Thank you so much for being here. Just two small questions,
yeah.
which you can, kind of answer. The first is about any career advice for young students or professionals who would like to have a career path similar to yours.
Um, I would say my advice would be to kind of really understand yourself and your own interests well. Uh, and I think a lot of I think most people actually don't understand themselves really well. So I feel like that's the first step, right? So, because I think what you want to do is make sure that you know exactly what's important to you, what's not important to you. And when you're young, it can be confusing to understand that, because there's so many people telling you what's important to them, and you confuse it as that being important to yourself. So really understanding your own personality, understanding what are you good at, what are you not good at, but what do you also want to be good at in the future, what are your strengths, what are your interests, what are some things you love doing, what gives you energy, what are some things that drain you, and then that gives you like a set of things to at least make your decisions based on, right? So I think any sort of career that you're choosing should be based on what works for you. I think you shouldn't be too rigid, in the sense that, because when you're that young, you also have not fully evolved, right? So you should also
Yeah.
keep room to grow as a person. So not be too rigid in kind of what you want to do, but at least know yourself well, and know like what are some things that you absolutely don't enjoy, and some things that you absolutely would love to do, because then that will guide you closer towards a decision in choosing something that will give you some level of fulfillment and stimulation. Because I think the one of the like it'll be really tragic for anyone to kind of be stuck for like decades doing things that you know uh,
Hmm.
don't kind of fulfill them at a fundamental level. I don't think it's realistic for every human being to kind of find their absolute ideal job, right? Because that's a very difficult thing to achieve. But I think it's possible for every human being to kind of get something that works for them, and that is fulfilling for them on some level. So I would just hold that as a vision, and not kind of be very clear what your voice is, and what differentiate your voice from like those of others. I'm not sure that that's helpful, but that's what came to mind.
No, that's exactly in the philosophy of my company. That's
Yeah,
exactly what I do, and I'm going to use this as a marketing tool now.
yeah.
But
So
yeah, so
basically,
I
don't
think.
listen to anyone except Saurabh Nanda and yourself.
And I also think Malyaji, and that is what I have been calling Aditya since our college days together. We worked so much together, and I think Malyaji, you and I think quite similarly for so many things.
Hmm.
It's just I think it's a very unique, interesting insight, but it's also quite similar in a lot of curious engineers. I think they'll have a similar thought process. But yeah, okay. Last question.
Yeah.
Um, One line which makes the world better.
So there's this quote by Bertrand Russell, which I really like, which I think is an apt summary of the world even today.
Hmm.
Um, So he says the problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are sure of themselves, but the wise are full of doubt. And so my line for the world that makes the world better is just for people to be a little bit more doubtful. And by doubtful, I mean like don't be so sure about others, but also don't be sure about yourself, and like be very confident that what you believe is the right thing and the only right perspective. So I think you can see this definitely in India at the moment, and you can see this everywhere in the world. So, and I think social media has kind of exacerbated that tribalism and group thinking and all of that. So yeah, I think independent thinking, I would say, is what would make the world better, and that independent thinking definitely comes with people being more open, less sure about themselves, more doubtful in a good way. So I think for me, that's what would make the world better.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that. I relate with that a lot. All right, Aditya, have a good one. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.